collaborative curriculum, research and development. And I'm really pleased to be co-hosting this important event today with my BERA colleagues, Sarah Selesnyov joining us from London, and all the way from Hong Kong, very late at night, my good colleague Wai-Peng Yang. We are absolutely delighted to be gathering today with experts in the field of play. Play is vital for living healthy, happy lives. The imagination is vital in helping us to make sense of the world that we live in, which seems increasingly challenging by the day. COVID, of course, focused our minds on opportunities and sometimes the lack of opportunities for play for people of all ages. My colleagues joining us today, whom I'm about to introduce, are leaders and experts in the field of play, and we've joined them to consider innovative ways to make playful learning a reality for all. It's my honour to introduce, first of all, our keynote speaker, Professor Elizabeth Wood of Sheffield University, whose research interests include play and pedagogy, early childhood curriculum and assessment, policy analysis and critique. Elizabeth's work has been widely published, and she is the author of seminal texts in this area, including a very important book on play, learning and curriculum. We are also joined today by three experts in no particular order. There's my own colleague from Belfast, Dr. Glenda Walsh, who is course director for the PGC in early years at Stranmillis University College and a principal lecturer. Glenda's research interests lie in quality issues in early childhood education, especially in pedagogy and curriculum. We're also joined today by Dr. Yinka Olusoga, who is Programme Director in the BA in Education, Culture and Childhood at Sheffield University. And Yinka's research interests include discourse and history of childhood, play and education, children's creative and digital literacies, and intergenerational co-construction of play and storytelling. Fascinating research interests there. And last but not least, we also have with us Dr. Christine O'Farrelly, who is the UKRI Future Leaders Fellow and Senior Research Associate at PEDAL Cambridge. PEDAL stands for the Centre for Play in Education, Development and Learning, based at the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. Christine's research focuses on developing and evaluating early childhood programmes, and her current projects are quite fascinating. You can read more about them on the PEDAL website. Before joining PEDAL, Christine worked at the Centre for Mental Health at Imperial College London. I'd like to extend the warmest welcome to all of our experts joining us, and it's a particular delight now to hand over to Professor Elizabeth Wood, who will deliver today's keynote. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay, Dan, I'm hoping that you can hear me because Dan is controlling my slides today because of a glitch in Microsoft Teams. So it is a privilege to be asked to speak to you today about play, and I have chosen as my topic the politics of play because I wanted to use this opportunity today to give us some pause for thought and to offer some political provocations about the state of play. I realise that there are many people here from beyond England. I am using the case of England to illustrate what I think are some of the problems with play in policies and practices, but I know the international literature well enough to know also that there are many similar concerns and many similar issues in debates about play in policy and play in practice. Next slide, Dan, please. So I'm going to start with some of the challenges for research and practice. We know that in terms of theory, there is a very strong critique of the dominance of child development theories and how they are continuing to influence early childhood policy frameworks and curriculum guidance in many different countries, and the concerns that that raises for equity and diversity in education systems. We all swim in the policy tide now, so we understand the influence of global discourses, how these have touched down. Now, some writers present the global discourse as hegemonic, as all-encompassing and as all-powerful. But the work that I'm doing currently with colleagues in Australia and New Zealand and in England shows that it's really important to look at the variations in touchdown of those policies at national, regional and local levels. So what we have in policy frameworks is varying degrees of guidance and prescription. We know that other discourses are impacting very powerfully on provision for early childhood education, and although it is considered essential for children in the immediate and their long-term future success, we still have these discourses of regulation, quality, standards, inspection and accountability. I'm not dismissing those discourses, but they have been subject to sustained critique in terms of their power effects on educators, on leaders, and on children. And we also know that economic investment in early childhood education must be justified by improved outcomes for children, with, again in England, a very strong emphasis on the discourse of school readiness. So if we focus on play, I would argue that what these discourses have produced is that play must earn its place in early childhood education. Thank you, Dan. I'm just going to remind you of a very brief and a highly selective policy genealogy in England, because I think it's important that we just reflect for a moment how much change and how much instability there has been in policy since around about 1999, and coming from the curriculum guidance for the foundation stage in 2000 right through to the relatively recent reinterpretation of the Early Years Foundation in 2020, you can see that there has been a lot of policy intervention. By way of comparison, if we look at New Zealand, the first iteration of Te Whāriki came on stream in around 1999. They have had one major review. So they've had a relatively stable policy environment in early childhood education. So bringing us up to date, the most recent documents from Ofsted include the Best Start in Life, which is a research review, and that is part of an ongoing curriculum review for the Early Years Foundation stage, where each of the areas of learning is going to have a separate review. Now, when I have shown similar slides in presentations in international contexts, colleagues have been genuinely surprised, and some have been quite shocked at the level of Ofsted intervention in matters of curriculum, pedagogy, play, and school readiness, as well as reading and phonics. So again, I think this is a pause for thought moment. Thank you, Dan. So what has this policy genealogy produced, again bringing us up to date? Ofsted has set itself up now as the sole arbiter of quality. But again, focusing on play, I would argue strongly that we've had 25 years of policy interventions that have actually produced an eviscerated understanding of play. And by eviscerated, I mean depriving play of its essential content and meaning and reducing complexity. And I think what has underpinned this process of evisceration is a simplification of play, a distortion of play, and a willful amnesia. Now, I know that there's around about 70 or 80 people on this seminar today. And when I looked at some of the participants, I recognised names of people who have done some outstanding work in early childhood education. I can remember working with Elizabeth Carruthers' work and Mulfrey Worthington's work on emergent mathematics and multimodality and the importance of different ways of communicating mathematical knowledge and experience. I can remember working with students on ideas about emergent literacy and how powerful those ideas were for understanding children as readers, as writers, as communicators, as artists, as designers, as mathematicians, as scientists. And what really troubles me is that almost everything we need to know about working with young children and developing play in generative ways is now subject to a willful amnesia. And I would urge people here to perhaps reconnect with some of that research, because it is extremely rich and still highly relevant to our understanding of play and playfulness in early childhood education. Thank you, Dan. So let's come back to the early years foundation stage. This is the eviscerated discourse around play that we are currently working with. We know that play must be planned and purposeful, but going back to the policy genealogy, you can trace through the documents an understanding of it might not be children's plans and purposes that are being privileged or even being foregrounded. I've already spoke about the problem of child development theories as underpinning knowledge, and I've written about the profound difference between taking a development leads learning orientation, which is what the current Development Matters takes, and taking an alternative orientation, which is that learning leads development, because both of those orientations produce very different ways of understanding children's capabilities and competencies. The early learning goals focus mostly on behaviour and skills, and if you look very carefully at them, there is a lot less on conceptual development and knowledge. There is an emphasis on direct and explicit teaching with a focus on literacy and mathematics. Now, I don't have any problems with direct and explicit teaching, and in the book I did in 2013, I wrote quite a lot about the importance of adults presenting concepts and knowledge to children, but doing that in emergent and appropriate ways. The early years foundation stage tells us that effective teaching is systematic and structured. There is an emphasis on the transition to formal learning by the end of the early years foundation stage. And again, we come back to this primacy of school readiness and how that is measured in the good level of development. And my colleague Louise Kay presents that as problematic. So this is the discourse that we are working with, and I think these are some examples of the way in which words, phrases, meanings get changed within the policy narrative. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about the importance of policy literacy. Thank you, Dan. So I come now to some selected claims from the Best Start in Life. This is Ofsted claims it to be a research review, and it is part of the wider government claim to making evidence-based policy. But those of you who know my work, and especially my work on policy critique, will know that I have argued that research reviews of this kind tend to create a circular discourse where evidence is selected to underpin the claims that are being made in the research review and the claims, the guidance that is then being formulated for practice. So I position this as another example of Ofsted's policy-led evidence making. Now, Ofsted claims that based on their research review in The Best Start in Life, high quality curriculum and pedagogy may have the following features. Thank you, Dan. So you will see that I have copied all 6 of these features, but I want really to focus on the last 3 because I have neither the time nor the emotional stamina, I think, to go through and critique all 6 of them. So I'm going to move to the next slide, please, Dan, and look at this claim that practitioners consider a child's interests when choosing activities, and they expand children's interests to make progress in all areas of learning. Now, of course, we know that children's interests are important and they can be the sources of curriculum. But I want to come back to this idea of complexity, that children's interests and their sources of knowledge are in themselves very complex. So if we look at the Frobel Trust project that I've been working on with Liz Chesworth, we found that children's interests develop from their participation in multi-generational family practices. All of these things I know will be familiar to you, whether you're a researcher of play or whether you are a practitioner or an advisor. Popular culture and television, film, digital media are coming up a lot in research on children's interests. But what we found was also important was the connections between interests and the sources and funds of knowledge. So for example, if we look at Aneni, who was a 4-year-old boy, bilingual, he had a deep interest in dinosaurs. The sources of knowledge included the internet, YouTube, watching the Geographic Channel at home with his family, but his interest in dinosaurs was also connected to a much wider interest in nature and the natural world. So a key question and a good provocation that Helen Hedges gives us in her work is, how do we understand interests not just as activity choices, but as fundamental sources of inquiry and coming to know and making meaning? So considering a child's interest when choosing activities is much more than the activity itself. And if I go back, thank you, Dan, next slide. Thank you. And if I go back to the work that I did with Michelle Hill, and this is based on her doctoral research, you will see that children's interests and funds of knowledge in freely chosen play encompassed a very wide range of topics, and the themes and the ideas and the concepts they were interested in. Sometimes you might think, well, where on earth did that come from? But again, children participate in their everyday worlds in their own ways and on their own terms, but they are active participants in many different communities of practice. So their interests have many different sources. And again, the important part of understanding interests is getting beneath the activity to understand the source and the meaning of those interests. Thank you, Dan. Next slide. So I've put these two claims together because they both directly influence how we are understanding play. So again, we've got the validation of play. Children's play is valued, but I think it's really important for us to just mark here that Ofsted has stopped using the word pedagogy. and has started to use the words teach and teaching. And I think that's actually quite significant. I think it's a significant change in the discourse, as is the word skillful adult intervention. And again, just thinking back to the research that's already out there, Julie Fisher has done some very detailed and helpful work on the challenges of positive adult interactions, but the importance of a whole range of different types of interactions with children as well. Here is the word teaching again. Explicit teaching is used to introduce children to new knowledge and followed up by practice through play. The difficulty I have with these claims, and again thinking about this is a curriculum session. There is an assumption that there is knowledge that children do not have, knowledge that we can give them, and knowledge that they will do something with. And again, that for me simply doesn't reflect the complexity of research on children's learning. Next slide, please, Dan. So, research, as we know, coming now to the field of play scholarship, and having been researching play for over 30 years, it is vast, it is fascinating, and it is always challenging. So let's have a kind of counter-narrative to this somewhat reductive and eviscerated understanding of play. We know that play is complex socio-cultural activity. Children develop play repertoires. We know that play is typically freely chosen. This is truly free play is freely chosen, led by children's choices and motivations, and it is linked to pretense and imagination. We also know that play involves multimodal expressions of meaning and activity, and those multimodal expressions are indications of their interests, their funds of knowledge, and how children themselves experience their social, cultural, and material worlds. And something that is also missing from the policy narrative is any understanding of progression in play. Play is assumed to end at age 5. But again, we know that from research that play progresses in complexity and challenge. And we actually cut children off from that complexity and challenge by withdrawing or reducing play. Thank you, Dan. And again, this is, I'm just conscious of the time, another very brief summary of the complexity of play based on research. Children are actively involved in co-creating their own developmental environments, and play is much more than being able to practice knowledge that has been imparted to them. Children express their agency, identities, heritages, interests, languages and cultural practices, and they draw on funds of knowledge from their homes, families and communities. And I think that if we turn the telescope around and we adopt a learning leads development orientation, we get a very different understanding of children's capabilities and competences. Thank you, Dan. Next slide, please. So I'm just briefly going to share with you some work that was done by a colleague, Christina Tatham, at Sheffield University. And Christina's work looks at children sharing multimodal, cultural and linguistic repertoires. She used cartoons and comics to gather data from the children, and the children themselves were active participants in the research project. Next slide, please, Dan. And I've chosen this slide because it's a really good example of knowledge exchange in play, and play as a community of practice with multilinguistic and multimodal cultural repertoires. And this is just one of very many examples in Christina's work, where children are sorting things out for themselves and telling each other about their own cultures, their own home languages, and then words and phrases circulate in the context of their play. Thank you, Dan. But this isn't all straightforward. And when we come to the context of practice, it is practitioners in their everyday work that have to work out some of the tensions between policy and practice. And some of these tensions, again, if we go back to research by Glenda, who has done some lovely work on playful learning and teaching, we see that play and work are not separate. However, play is being pushed to the margins of practice, and there is a lot of research here in England and elsewhere that supports that statement. I would argue that it is no longer necessary to talk about formal and informal learning. We should just be talking about learning, not least because digital literacies have blurred those boundaries. There are tensions between standardization and diversity. And for me, and again, coming back to this idea as curriculum, there needs to be a much better understanding in policy of curriculum as planned experiences and emergent curriculum. Now, curriculum as co-construction, including children's interests, funds of knowledge, and funds of identity, is not an easy option. And it may even present a risk to practitioners when they know that they have an Ofsted inspection looming. However, curriculum making is dynamic. It is more ethical than and because it encompasses diversity, and curriculum making ensures that children are active participants in coming to know and expressing what is of importance for them. Next slide, please, Dan. So what happens if we come back to this idea of play for its own sake? We know that play is a bridge between the cultures and practices of home and school, and we've already talked about funds of knowledge and funds of identity. Children are adept at sharing meanings and purposes, what is important for them, including their knowledge of popular culture. And knowledge is global and local. We know from recent research on digital literacies and multimodality that children are connecting with global discourses, but playing with those ideas in local ways and contextualizing their play locally and with meaning. And although the Best Start in Life talks about play being a context where children can practice their knowledge, again, I'll argue very strongly that there is a much stronger claim for using and applying, not just practicing, because children want to be knowledgeable. Knowledge is power. So we should be looking at knowledge in use and in meaningful contexts and what children do with their knowledge and why it's important for them. Thank you, Dan. Next slide. The earliest foundation stage, as we know, tracks children on an individual basis. Learning is seen as something that is situated within the individual child. However, we know from research that agency is collective and distributed across social, material, and relational contexts. The idea of agency being collective is particularly important when we are looking at play, the way in which children play collaboratively. We've talked about the significance of developmental and socio-material environments. And there are texts out there, there is a lot of research about the importance of responsive and in-the-moment planning, co-constructed curriculum. I've written a great deal about integrated pedagogical approaches. However, all of those approaches demand high levels of professional knowledge and expertise. And I would argue that those high levels of professional knowledge are simply not respected or represented in some Ofsted policy documents. So I don't want to end on a gloomy note. And in the project that we're currently finishing that looks at leadership in Australia and England, we're writing a lot at the moment about the importance of policy literacy, that we need to read texts, whether we're researchers, leaders, head teachers, classroom practitioners. We need to read policy with a critical eye, because it's important that we reflect on what policy is trying to do. And in the research on leadership, we're writing a lot about policy mediation and the ways in which educational leaders in this case do a lot of work on policy mediation, because the daily focus of work in early childhood settings is on children, families, and communities. So as a result, we are currently writing about how professional educators enact policy otherwise. And we think this is a very fruitful area for discussion. And there is a book forthcoming and a paper currently in progress, as always. So my final slide, thank you, Dan. So if we want to develop a new politics of play, I'm arguing that we need to ask critical questions about play, and it's important that we ask our own critical questions. But these questions are about knowledge. What knowledge is valued and whose knowledges are valued in early childhood education? And what about children's repertoires, practices, and languages? If we ask who and what is at the margins, we would also need to ask the question, what happens when play is at the margins? Because much of the research that Christina did on children's play noticed that children were translanguaging at the margins of classroom practice. We need to look at the way in which digital traditional play and digital literacies are expanding children's play repertoires. And finally, is play in policy? Does that mean that play is in crisis? I worry, and have been worried for some years, that play is in crisis. So my final provocation is, so what can be done about play in practice? Thank you, Dan. You can end the presentation.
Thank you so much, Professor Wood, for that fascinating talk. I'm sure everyone in the audience would like to join me in thanking you most warmly for encouraging us to consider policy and practice in play and curriculum, drawing on your rich experience and seminal work in this complex field of play scholarship. We're really pleased that Professor Wood has agreed to take some questions now and have some conversation around the issues that she has provoked, that she has raised. And my good colleague Sarah is going to be monitoring the chat. There's a little speech bubble at the top of our screen, and if you press on that, you can see the chat. And that's possibly the easiest way to tell us what your question is, but you could also give us a virtual wave. There's a little hand at the top, so if you want to raise your hand virtually and ask your question to Professor Wood yourself, that's fine. So do get typing in those questions. While we're waiting for some audience questions to come through, I think I will kick off perhaps, Professor Wood, with a very general question on your presentation, but more, I suppose, in terms of your own professional interest in play. Are there particularly inspiring figures or contexts in terms of either policy or practice in play that you look to yourself to guide how you interpret policy and so on?
Right. That's an interesting question, because if I have a doctoral student who comes to me and says, I really want to do something on play, I always say to them, go and read Brian Sutton Smith. I think that for me, and I know he had an enormous body of work, but Brian Sutton Smith really tuned me in to play as multidisciplinary, extremely complex activity, but also that deep respect that Brian Sutton Smith had for children's agency, intellect, and competence.
Brilliant. So that's some homework for all of us to do when we finish the call. Sarah, anything in the chat?
Yeah, a first question for Professor Wood. Is there any research that you know about, Professor Wood, in relation to how parents' perceptions of play changed during the COVID-19 pandemic?
I just typed a response to that because I think Yinka's work is probably more tuned in to that. Yeah.
And a question from Wai Peng. A question from Molly Misha. How do you believe play could play a role at the core of the wider primary curriculum? So looking beyond early years.
Goodness, that's enormous. That is a huge, that's like half a day's professional development. I think keeping some open-endedness and creativity and space in the curriculum, whether it's early years foundation stage, key stage 1, key stage 2. And this, I would say that the same principles that I have set out for young children apply equally across the lifespan. So for example, at Sheffield University, we have a maker space in the engineering department so that engineers get in touch, or if they didn't have it already, they get in touch with their playfulness and creativity.
Thank you.
Wai
Peng, should we encourage digital play among young children, and what are the key considerations?
So a brief answer to that, Wai Peng, is yes, but with the caveats of safeguarding, general safety, general considerations about mental, physical health. The key issue for me around digital play is that we enable children to produce content so that they are not just consuming content produced for them, because some content, some apps are truly, truly appalling. Some are good, some not so good. Kate,
so when will the leadership research that you mentioned be published?
Okay, we've published around about 5 articles already. If you want the references, please can you send me an email and I'll send the references to you. The book should be published by the end of the year, and there's another couple of articles in progress.
Thank you, Professor Wood. Sorry, Sarah, I'm just pointing out that the chat is kind of on fire at the minute, lots coming through the chat, which is fantastic, and some comments as well. Sarah, I note Emma Neal notes that Scotland use play at playtimes across primary schools with open-ended loose parts, which sounds very intriguing. But yeah, it's great. One of the great things about an event like this is that we can bring folk together from all parts of the UK and beyond. So thanks for those comments too, Sarah.
Another question, Julie McLammon. Have you got experience of practitioner confidence in advocating for play in the face of opposition to playful learning?
We're currently, Liz Chesworth and I have been working with a school and an academy trust in London. I don't think they have opposition to playful learning, but we're supporting practitioner confidence by doing a very tailored research project for them, where they are able to say what their goals are, to support them. They've asked to continue engaging with the research, with Helen Hedges' work, for example. So I think you advocate for play on the basis of increasing your knowledge and increasing your understanding of what the research says to justify your practice. So that's a really important step for me.
And perhaps time for one final question from Nadia Mahjoub. Can you recommend any reading on creativity or playful learning in engineering, particularly for Key Stage 1 or 2?
Okay, Nada, you need to go to the work on maker spaces. You will find an enormous amount of research, and again, Yinka may be able to say a bit more about this. But there's when we move to the next speaker, I'll put the Makerspaces link for you in the chat box, so you can start to have a look at that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor Wood, for that, and to the audience also for those questions, and to Sarah for fielding them. Just to say that we are going to move now to a session that Sarah's going to chair called Meet the Experts. So we have 3 more experts who are going to present to us. And following that, we will have time for breakout rooms, and we'll use that time, short time in breakout rooms, to generate questions for them. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sharon. And just a quick introduction to our 3 speakers before I hand over to them. So first of all, we have Dr. Christine O'Farrelly, then we will have Dr. Yinka Olusoga, and finally, Professor Glenda Walsh. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Christine O'Farrelly from the PEDAL unit in Cambridge University.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and very, very difficult to follow Professor Wood's excellent keynote presentation. Just trying to get my slides to work here. Here we go. Sorry about that. So I am a research psychologist by background. I lead a research programme called Helping Little Minds Thrive on Early Mental Health. And I'm based at the Centre for Research on Play in Education Development and Learning at the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. Just to acknowledge our funders there for some of our work, I'm going to only talk to you about a really small snapshot of the work that we do at PEDAL. So please do check out our website, where you can learn about other research projects that are running. So my own research or interest in playful learning started in a research project that I was working on the transition to school. And so we've seen this increasing interest in trying to reduce disparities in the experiences and skills that we see across the kind of socioeconomic spectrum for children as they enter through the school doors, and growing interest in developing and testing interventions and programs to try and reduce these disparities. And we were working on one at University College Dublin that ran from pregnancy until children started school. But what we noticed was that we knew very little about what mattered to children themselves. So what did being ready for school mean to children? What did early school adjustment mean to children themselves? So in a way to address this, we ran a study called the Children's Thoughts About School study, where we carried out participatory interviews with children themselves, so 42 children in the first year of school. You can find out more about what we did and kind of the breadth of findings in our research papers, but I wanted to highlight 4 of the kind of main take-home messages that children offered us in terms of what was important from their perspective. So one was around the importance of feeling able, so had this sense of agency that children enjoyed feeling, and this idea that they could persist or move on when they encounter challenges. So it wasn't just that they were able to do something, but they had this ability to keep going in the face of challenges that they might experience in their learning. Also, this importance of loving school, looking forward to school, and this enthusiasm for school. Knowing how to navigate peer relationships, so to make and maintain friends, was really important to children. As was the strong links between school and family. So of course, children's experiences in these settings is not discrete, it's borderless, and children very much kind of gave us a mandate for the importance of strong links across these settings. What I wanted to focus on, though, was the strong message that children also gave us around the importance of having supportive environments and opportunities for play. This was really striking because usually what happens is that children lament the loss of play when you interview them in the first year of school. So they talk about how they used to get to play and now that there's a focus on work. But these children were taking part in a pilot in the community to deliver the curriculum through playful approaches. And children really endorsed this. So they emphasised the importance of having rich and varied opportunities for play. Play was the best thing about school to them. It allowed them to feel happy, and in giving advice for other children who might be starting school, it was important that other children would get to know that you were able to play when you started school. Children spoke about play that happened in the classroom, but they put a real emphasis on play that happened outside of the classroom as well, so outdoor play. And this seemed to offer them different opportunities than the play that would happen in the classroom in terms of opportunities for movement, for freedom of thought, for freedom of play ideas, and scope for imagination. So just to give you a couple of illustrative quotes, there was tens and tens of quotes across the group of children in terms of the importance of play. But we can see children talking about play in the classroom, the importance of play centres, somewhere you can play, do construction sand. At that moment they had set up a shop so they could have sociodramatic play around going and doing the shopping, but also spoke about the play that they would have in the playground, where, for example, this child talks about you can draw with chalk, you can draw anything, and it's big, it's like this, it's bigger than my hand. So you get this real sense of freedom that the outdoor space was providing to the children. So this was a really strong endorsement of the importance of having playful learning approaches as children entered into reception. And at PEDAL, we had the opportunity to look across the available evidence for playful learning. So studies that had looked at playful learning and had compared it maybe to direct instruction or to free play, what could they tell us about playful learning? And we focused specifically on guided play as a playful learning approach. And so to us, we would see guided play as combining the very best elements of free play in terms of how that brings on board children's intrinsic motivation, their desire for exploration, their sense of agency, as alongside the support from an experienced partner. So we would see that it's generating a kind of optimal learning environment for children. So there's three characteristics to guided play that we were looking for in the literature. So the adult would have a learning goal in mind that could be rooted in the curriculum. The child, the play should be child-led as much as possible. So the child should have a degree of choice and agency. And the adult should use guidance approaches like using open-ended questions or prompts and modelling flexibly, tailoring this to the child's interests and needs. So this sort of playful learning would look differently for different children. So what we found then was 39 studies that had compared guided play approaches to either free play or direct instruction. And when we looked at these, we found that for most outcomes, the guided play was as effective as traditional teaching or direct instruction approaches. And in some cases, particularly around early math skills, guided play, we found it to be more effective than direct instruction. So an encouragement to think about the potential of playful learning approaches alongside other teaching techniques as well. So it's important to say that this, as all research, it comes with a bit of a health warning in that the quality was mixed across studies. And we also found quite a lot of diversity in terms of how studies conceptualized, but also how they implemented guided play as well. But we wanted to see whether we could do some research to think about how we might support teachers in using guided play in the classroom. So we are in the process of developing and testing a program called Playback, which is a 5-session program for teachers in reception. And this is around supporting the teacher-child relationship, but also teachers' use of guided play approaches. We use something called video feedback, which we've used in a lot of our other research with families, to provide a collaborative and reflective space for teachers to think about developing their practice alongside a facilitator. So in terms of what the visits look like, the facilitator will go out to the school, will take a clip of the teacher interacting with a small group, with children in a small group context, will then go away in the intervening week and prepare some feedback. And then the next time they visit the school, they'll explore the video footage with the teacher, focusing on the positive moments of interaction. So just to give you a very, very quick example of a guided play session to encourage positional language. So the teacher will be, in this case, is given a book that had a narrative that was written positional language, also some blocks for the children to play and create as they wanted to, and the teacher was encouraged to bring attention to positional language in the children's play as they play. So what next? We're going to continue to co-design the programme so that it's helpful to teachers and children and it's feasible to deliver. There's lots of challenges in this space in trying to do something like this in the reality and everyday reality of schools. I'm very keen to understand not just the role of play in facilitating language and numeracy outcomes, but how it might support children's love of learning, how they see themselves as learners and how they feel about school as an experience that underpins other learning experiences for children. And then to offer up a provocation or a question for us to think about is how we can involve children in setting our research and practice priorities for playful learning. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Yes, I'll hand back over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Christine. Do pose your questions for Christine into the chat. We will be taking questions at the end of all 3 presentations. So if you can just indicate if there's anyone specific your question is for, we will come to those at the end. I'm going to hand over now to Yinka. Christy, is that yours, Yinka? You're coming up. It's all very smooth and efficient. Before I could even say it, there she is on the screen. Welcome, Yinka. Very much looking forward to hearing your presentation.
And I'll put my mic on because that would help, wouldn't it? Okay, so thank you very much. I was so interested to hear what's been happening in the previous 2 talks. I think it very much links to what I was going to talk about too. So I'm going to give a brief introduction today to the work of the Play Observatory, which is a project that's been focused on researching children's play during the pandemic. And I begin with this image of a lino print that was created by an autistic boy and his father during the first UK lockdown to record and value an idea from that child that I would want to return to at the end of the presentation. And it reads, "I don't want life to go back to normal. I want it to go back to better." So the Play Observatory is a collaboration between researchers at the School of Education at the University of Sheffield and 2 different departments at University College London, the Institute of Education and the Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis. And the team members there are shown on the slide. It's an ESRC funded project that began in November of 2020 and ended in March 2022, and we're still engaged in the analysis of our data. And it was created in response to a funding call for projects to address the pandemic from a range of perspectives. And we saw a real opportunity to focus on children's experiences during the pandemic via a focus on their everyday play worlds. And the team has worked together in various combinations on a number of projects linked to the British Academy Research Project, Childhoods and Play, which centres on the archive of the 20th century folklorists for children's play, Iona and Peter Opie. So our team includes expertise from cultural studies, folklore studies, history of childhood, media literacies, multimodality and education. The final cartoon member of the team is Peeps, who was co-designed with children and signalled our intention to centre the experiences of children and young people and their testimonies of them and their families at the heart of our research. And we also had a number of partners, including the British Library, Great Ormond Street Hospital, and Young V&A, which was formerly the V&A Museum of Childhood. So, and this was echoing what Elizabeth was saying earlier, from the beginning, we applied a broad understanding of play, and we were heavily influenced by the work of Brian Sutton Smith. So we're really interested in children and young people's play, leisure and cultural worlds in all their complexity. And as mentioned earlier, the project is multidisciplinary, brings together the social sciences, the arts and digital humanities. It's synchronic and diachronic, so we're focused on understanding the contemporary everyday experiences of children now, but preserving this for future generations. So This is my habit of being a historian who wants to record history as it's happening. But also we want to place these experiences in dialogue with archival evidence of children's play in the past, particularly in other times of crisis. So we wanted to record and value play and what children and those closest to them had to say. And we created different streams of activity for that to happen. So the project had to be conducted entirely online, and it was designed with data collection via 3 streams of activity. So firstly, a national, though it turned out to be an international, online child-centred survey that included the option to upload media files to illustrate written contributions. We conducted 10 online ethnographic interviews involving a total of 14 children and their families. And we held online media production workshops on the topic of play and COVID, held with young filmmakers. Most of the contributions to the Play Observatory focused on play in home and community, but we did get some insight into play at school via the interviews. So an emergent strand, emergent strands within the data definitely emphasised that play was surviving the pandemic, play was sometimes referencing the pandemic, and play was adapting to the pandemic. So although lockdown impacted many aspects of life, everyday play and leisure activity managed to survive those restrictions. The lockdown habit of daily time, spent outdoors, gave us contributions to the survey that talked about going for walks in woodlands and parks, and when they were open, visiting playgrounds. Children were also playing in paddling pools, riding bikes, flying kites, making dens. Dens were a big theme. They were learning new skills, as you can see in this at the bottom here, about learning to roller skate, and also practicing old ones like tennis, someone was talking about in one of the entries here. They were playing indoors, making models, reading jigsaws, making indoor dens, and playing in digital spaces, such as video games such as Minecraft. Many contributions to the observatory offer examples of pandemic featuring a reference point in children's play, and of children exploring and developing their own working theories about the virus, the pandemic, and its discourses and practices. So in the examples on this slide, we have a report of a 4-year-old creating a socially distanced cafe and sourcing his own version of PPE. We have vaccination and socially distanced queuing, referenced in the second example, which also features toys wearing face masks. Especially in the early days of the pandemic, the coronavirus itself became this visual motif that children encountered repeatedly. And the example at the bottom there is of a child's model of the virus made from an orange and some wooden kebab sticks. And then at the right at the bottom, we have lateral flow testing. So that became this feature of home life for adults and older children, and started also to feature in younger children's play too. On this slide, we see an example of how some of the visual motifs of the pandemic again featured in play. We've got this drawing of a hand and some hand sanitizer surrounded by rainbows and flowers and butterflies. At the top, we have a Lego hospital, and in our contributions, we saw hospitals cropping up quite a lot in Lego and building blocks and in Minecraft. 2 images involving dolls show us Barbie and her family exercising at home with Joe Wicks and sitting outside wearing face masks. The daily briefings that we mentioned earlier also appear in play, with children actually taking on the role of setting rules. And this featured very entertainingly in some of the film contributions we had to the observatory. The drawing at the bottom right from a 5-year-old also, I think, reflects her awareness of the virus as a thing outside of the home, and her theories about staying at home as a way to avoid the virus and avoid upset. So in these and other contributions, we see children in their play demonstrating that they were very much aware of the pandemic, and in their play exploring their experience and their understanding of it. Adaptations of play were happening even before we went into lockdown. So particularly the game of Tiggy. So as has happened across history, Tiggy reflected children's awareness of contemporary discourses and concerns, and adaptations to the game involve, tagging with elbows or shadow tagging. Some more worrying for adult ones involved coughing on people. As families became confined to spaces in and near the home, the finding of local spaces featured in many contributions, and an appreciation of what was on the doorstep that perhaps hadn't been there before. We also saw communal play scripts starting to develop, in this example of the painting and placing of stones as acts of participation and community. And I absolutely love this example at the bottom there from a family who were quarantined in a hotel. So if you thought you were claustrophobic in your own home, I think in a hotel room with children sounds very interesting. But they reported how, for the children, dancing in the hotel shower became a favourite play activity. Digital and hybrid forms of play also offered ways for play to adapt to the conditions of the pandemic. So multiplayer games such as Roblox and Among Us enabled children to connect across space and across generations. Skype and Zoom similarly provided digital spaces for ritual observances like birthday celebrations, for friends to connect via weekly quizzes, grandparents to feature as playmates. So we have an example here in the image of repurposed cardboard boxes becoming a pair of dolls' houses constructed in different homes but played with together via Skype, developing shared play scripts involving a cat getting stuck on the roof. And one of my personal favourites, virtual hide and seek, discovering the new affordances of being able to slip grandma and grandpa in an iPad into a kitchen drawer or under the sink. And filmmaking, animation and various forms of cultural production feature in contributions to the survey and in the media production workshops that were held towards the end of the project. And I haven't got time to go into these in depth, they're so rich, but it's important to note that children, including very young children, were using various forms of media for creative self-expression. And they were collaborating with other children and with adults in their projects. And really importantly, I think, they had their own commentary to make about the pandemic that can really help us to look at the pandemic from their perspectives. So starting with the two stills on the left, the top one is a contribution to the survey from a 10-year-old of a film called Park Police, and it stars his toddler sister, who is very forcefully enforcing social distancing rules in their local park. And the bottom one is from a silent movie made by one of our media workshop attendees, aged 8, and explores how her experience of homeschooling and lockdown divided up her day and left her feeling isolated from friends. The two images at the right of the screen come from children who had contracted COVID, that was later on in 2021, and had self-isolated in their bedrooms. And there's a dark and slightly scary aspect to them both. The artwork at the top is from a 13-year-old girl and was created during a night when she was ill with COVID and unable to sleep. And it makes use of scraps of paper in her room to create a collage of faces and emotions. The film still at the bottom is from an 11-year-old boy and tells a very disturbing tale of him trapped in his room, self-isolating, but with a character who's escaped from the game of Guess Who, and it keeps popping up suddenly in strange places. So, although lockdown was generally perceived by many people as a period of rupture and of being stuck in place, from our data it seems that for some children at least, the conditions of the pandemic facilitated a hybridity and fluidity of play that was intra and intergenerational, that was offline, online and hybrid, that was play within constrained spaces, but play that managed to actually cross divides of space. Time came up again quite a lot in our contributions, an unhurried play, uninterrupted play, and strong links between play, affect and emotion. And we saw in our analysis this entangled interaction of the human and the more than human. We're starting to think about in our analysis opportunities that we can see in the practices of play that we have in these contributions, opportunities to reimagine learning through particularly for filmmaking and transludic practices in children's pandemic play, and that's one of the themes that we're developing in our analysis at the moment. So in our data, we see children and adults, being resourceful, creative, active participants in very complex affective networks, co-constructing and sustaining playful projects, pitching in and participating, and that ranging, as I say, across these boundaries of space and time and connecting across generational hierarchies. However, the dominant discourse in relation to children's experience of the pandemic has tended to be that of lost learning and the thing need to go back to normal. And as a historian, I always found that quite interesting because we've only had mass schooling for 150 years. So spending most of your week in batches of people born within 12 months of you is historically a relatively, recent thing. So we worry that perhaps this discourse prevents us from appreciating, learning from, and building on the playful cultural production in the provision that we construct for and with children. It prevents us, as this child who I started with has argued, going back to better. So questions we're now addressing to finish with in our analysis include: how do we co-construct curricula that acknowledge the experiences, knowledge and literacies that children developed during the pandemic? But also, how do we level the playing field for those whose experiences may have been restricted due to factors such as the digital divide and poverty? And how do we make space and time for children to experience curriculum in different configuration? For example, in vertical grouping, co-constructing playful projects within and beyond school, and with time to develop their ideas. So I'm going to stop there. This is a little hint of the publications that are out there, but also forthcoming. So there's one coming up, as I said, about the filmmaking, and then we're also working on a special issue of Global Studies of Childhood, which will be out early next year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yinka, for presenting that really, really interesting take on play in the COVID pandemic there. Last but by very much not least, I'm going to hand over to Professor Glenda Walsh from Stranmillis University, who's going to give our final presentation. And as I said, do put questions into the chat. We will come to questions after this final presentation. Thank you, Glenda. Are you all right?
Yes, can you see my screen okay?
We can, yeah.
Super,
yeah.
That's great. Okay, everyone, I'm delighted to have been given the opportunity to share with you some of the work that we have been doing on play, particularly within the context of the primary classroom and within Northern Ireland in that sense. So the title of my presentation, it's more than just play, infusing playfulness into practice in the primary classroom, a Northern Ireland story. So realistically, within Northern Ireland, play in primary classrooms really came to the fore as a result of the Northern Ireland Foundation Stage, which was introduced as part of the revised Northern Ireland curriculum in around 2007. And before that, realistically, much of what was happening in our primary schools in Northern Ireland was really quite traditional, where children were sitting at their seats for the most part of the day, engaging in formal literacy and numeracy tasks. So very much the foundation stage emphasises the fact that 4 to 6-year-old children should experience much of their learning through well-planned and challenging play, and learning should be supported by teachers who are committed, sensitive, enthusiastic, and interact effectively to challenge children's thinking and learning. And unlike the English context that Elizabeth presented to us earlier, this is the only curriculum that we've had for play within the last sort of 20 years, and we haven't changed anything as yet in that sense within Northern Ireland. So the foundation stage curriculum itself is very heavily informed by the early years enriched curriculum evaluation, whereby in the sort of the beginning around 2000, we introduced an innovative play-based intervention in our Year 1 and our Year 2 classes. And the aim of this intervention was very much to remove the early experience of persistent failure and promote children's own sense of self-competence and self-esteem. And it was an 8-year evaluation focused principally on 24 schools in total, and it was very multi-method and multi-source in perspective, as you can see. And the key findings from the enriched curriculum were generally very positive. The parents themselves believed that the enriched curriculum, the more play-based approach, imposed less pressure on children and would benefit learning in the longer term. Teachers in the main were enthusiastic about the approach, believing that yes, it was appropriate for all children. And the findings, particularly in those high quality settings, pointed to children's enhanced learning dispositions, their enhanced social and emotional development. And despite the somewhat depressed scores in formal reading and maths tests at the end of year 2, the enriched curriculum children's reading scores and maths scores tended to match those of the controlled classes in later years. So generally speaking, the enriched curriculum findings were positive in nature. But when we delved deeper into those findings and we undertook follow-up studies, what very much came to the fore was the fact that play and practice is highly controversial and problematical. And we also found that teachers themselves did lack confidence and competence in terms of translating a high-quality, playful approach into practice. And therefore, as a result, not all of the children across Northern Ireland were having access to play, let alone good quality play in their educational setting. And we did find that simply providing more play-based and practical tasks in terms of quantity didn't necessarily promote and extend children's cognitive and metacognitive processes. So what we saw in practice were some teachers who adopted a very maturistic approach, where they said, right now, we have to do play, we're developing a more play-based approach in practice, so we just stand back and we allow it all to happen naturally in that sense. And then an opposite trend within the enriched curriculum teachers was adopting still quite a didactic approach within their play, whereby they were still telling children what to do and how to do it, but using more practical and play-based activities. And again, as Elizabeth has already pointed to, there were those pressures from above. There was this kind of politicisation of play that was taking place within those early years classrooms, where teachers felt restricted, constrained, still having to meet educational targets, and they were confused how to do it and what might work best in practice in that sense. And one of the underpinning issues that very much came to the fore where teachers were concerned, and the dilemma that they were experiencing, was allowing children to express their autonomy and creativity through play, but at the same time ensuring enough challenge to ensure genuine progression in children's social, emotional, cognitive and thinking skills. So therefore, when we delved much deeper into the evidence base, we very much would suggest that the answer lies not just in terms of just play, but in terms of infusing playfulness into the teaching and learning experience. So what do we mean by playfulness as opposed to just play? Well, just play we very much see as seeing play as a mere activity, whereby playfulness for us can be characterised as both an internal state and a set of behaviours. The internal state refers to feelings of well-being, engagement, lightheartedness, pleasure, joy. High playfulness behaviour is characterised by liveliness, expressiveness, creativity, imagination, good humour, cheerfulness, comedy, a bit of fun, and a wish to share and interact with others. And when we went back into those settings that rated highest in terms of the quality learning instrument, we very much found that it was the overall level of playfulness that made the difference in terms of ensuring an overall quality, high quality of the learning experience. And in terms of infusing playfulness into practice, it was seeing play as a more expansive notion of play in practice, where playfulness was not only infused into the experiences themselves in that respect, but also into the spaces where children were playing, and also in terms of the actual interactions, in terms of the teachers interacting with the children and the children interacting with the teachers. And something that we are beginning to look more significantly into is trying to think of this notion about how can we teach teachers to be playful in their practice, and how can we go about doing it? Some see it, it's innate, it's natural, but for others, it's something that is that little bit more complex. And we're trying to work at that at the minute and research that more fully with our student teachers. So therefore, we very much see the role of the teacher in the early years playful setting as being a playful professional. So someone who is highly enthusiastic, but not just being silly and a mere clown. Somebody who's a partner, who works in close collaboration with the children, not simply a follower. And someone who is highly professional. Putting a playful teaching and learning approach into practice is anything but easy, as Elizabeth pointed out in her keynote presentation. And therefore, it's important that we're not mere amateurs. And the findings also point to the fact that when playfulness is infused into practice, it ensures higher levels of child engagement. Children are interested in what they're doing, and therefore they're engaged in what they're doing. It allows them to be highly creative. They're not being told how to do things and what way they should do it. It opens up opportunities for them to be highly imaginative in what they do. And it removes the pressure in terms of their emotional well-being. It allows them to be relaxed and enjoy what's happening in the early years of primary schooling. So we would very much argue that it's much more than just play in the early years of primary. And I would say that the time is right, therefore, for all involved in early years education to be key actors and work together to move beyond the narrow, superficial and low-level interpretations of play and practice. That is what we perceive as just play, and instead embrace more advanced and sophisticated appreciation of play as playful pedagogies, with the support of playful professionals to inspire more playful children and in turn more engaged learners in our early years classrooms. Surely our youngest children deserve it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenda. Very interesting one for me, who does a lot of training with my own staff around that balance between challenge and letting children play. Love that. I think we're running a little bit over, but I'm going to just field one question to each of the participants before we move on, if that's okay, Sharon. And I'm going to start with Christine. Christine, given your previous role at Imperial, just a question about your knowledge about the relationship between mental health and play. What is the connection between mental health and play?
It's probably more than I can say in a short response, but we would see these as being really inextricably linked, and starting from the first months of life and carrying on thereafter. So we know that responsive interactions are really important for laying the foundations of mental health for children, and so many of those are playful with parents and caregivers and early educators. Beyond that, that's where children learn that others can delight in them, that their ideas matter, that to try out, express, understand, navigate their emotions, but crucially in a low stakes environment when it happens in play. They can test and try these things out, and to a practice ground for getting along with others, and that goes from the family through to all of the kind of environments that children find themselves in. But one of the reasons we're interested in playback as an approach is particularly thinking about how we support the transition to school for children who are at risk of a more difficult transition, including those children who might be struggling more with their behaviour than their peers. And this because of success we've had with using that as an approach in the family, but thinking about bringing it to the school. What struck me about the research we did in Ireland was these were children who were at risk of dropping out of school and not achieving. And yet when we went and spoke to them, these were children who loved school, who saw themselves as capable and competent, but in a sense we're ultimately going to be written off by society. And so when you have play in place, you are supporting children to see that value in themselves and the opportunities that they can bring to their environments and relationships around them. So play is such a big answer to the challenges we're dealing with mental health across the life course. So would love to say more, but don't want to use up all the time.
Thank you, Christine. A question for Yinka. To what extent, Yinka, do you think that these collective play experiences that you've collated have continued since the pandemic, or not, as the case may be?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think, you know, it probably depends on circumstances, doesn't it? So I do notice that a lot of families are operating perhaps in different ways than they used to, with more working from home and perhaps availability of parents, and more appreciation, I think, of things like the local environment. Some of the projects that we saw, you know, they were incredibly interesting and very varied. So we had one set of families in Birmingham who had created an online magazine, which is continuing, and that is, you know, written, you know, by children and illustrated and edited, and so it's called Home Cool Kids, and I would absolutely recommend reading it because it's incredible quality that they've produced, but really fascinating and very extended opportunities to really see how children were thinking about and experiencing the pandemic, but also this collaborative intergenerational ways of actually producing things. And certainly with our filmmakers, you know, they, as well as producing and uploading films to our survey, one of our things we did in a symposium was we had a screening of some films that we commissioned from them, and that was amazing. You know, it was kind of like a BFI thing where they showed their films, and it was, you know, we got a chance to ask the filmmaker, and some of those children and young people are still involved in filmmaking and wanting to pursue that. So that's the big question, I think, is how has that happened for everybody, and did some people not get that in the first place?
Thank you, Yinka. And finally, a very interesting question here for Glenda. Glenda, do you think that play is important in the context of Northern Ireland as a society emerging from conflict?
Well, I think play is important in Northern Ireland in any case, irrespective of the conflict or not, in that sense, but very much so. I do feel, as we have learnt this afternoon and heard time and time again, play affords children that opportunity to play out their funds of knowledge, to play out those experiences in practice. And if it is in a playful, relaxed space where they can try things out, talk to one another, integrate with one another, and you know what I mean, get the opportunity to share their thoughts and feelings in an open environment, well, then it can only help those children in that sense. But I do feel it's important that it's not just good for Northern Ireland because of our background, it's good for Northern Ireland, full stop.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to hand back over to Sharon now. Thank you very much to Yinka, Glenda and Christine. Really interesting.
Thank you, Sarah, and expert guests. That was absolutely fascinating. So many pertinent issues. Just amazing. I enjoyed that immensely. Okay, well, I think as we arrive back into one virtual room again, I'm looking for my colleague Wai Peng, who is going to chair the final session. We certainly, hello Wai Peng, it's always good to see the chair of the next session. We certainly have two questions from our group. Sarah, did you get a few questions as well?
I have one.
I
Wai
haven't got
Peng
any specific questions from my
Can you hear
group.
me?
Yeah.
How many do you have?
I don't have a specific question. I'm hoping people will put their questions in the chat based on the conversation that they
Sure.
had in the room.
That's great. Okay, Wai Peng, I think people are still arriving back.
I think so.
Yeah, maybe just a couple of minutes. Having said that, I'm aware of time. We're actually on time. We were hoping to have our final panel at 17:45 and it's 17:43, so we're doing pretty good.
Well done, Sharon. That is a nigh on impossible, keeping things to time.
I've had sleepless nights running up to this, Professor
no.
Wood, so I'm glad that we're on time.
Well done.
But it's been absolutely wonderful, very, very rich afternoon, lots of things to go and think about. But I think we are ready, Wai Peng, possibly to take it away for the final panel. And the final panel is questions for Professor Woods and the three other experts. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for joining us, everyone, for this final panel discussion, where we have the pleasure of having our esteemed guest speakers with us today. And my name is Wei Pen from the British Curriculum Forum, and I will be co-chairing this section. Sarah will be monitoring the chat for any questions that may come up during the discussion. As per the plan, we will be taking questions from the breakout rooms. I will go around each of the three groups in turn and take questions for the whole panel. The panel can decide who answers, or the questions can be directed to individual panel members. Okay, so we have a limited amount of time, so I just kindly request everyone to keep their questions short and concise, and this will allow us to cover as many questions as possible during the session. Okay, without further ado, let's begin with the first group's questions for the panel. So I guess it's the group led by Sharon.
Thanks, Wai Peng. We have a question, first of all, open to everyone on the panel. How do you negotiate the different paradigms that exist in understanding play? Yinka, you're nodding your head. Would you like to take that one?
I'm just nodding because, the Play Observatory, with that multidisciplinary approach, that was very much really important, actually developing a shared vocabulary, but also expanding our vocabularies and expanding the lenses that we can use to think about play. And so I think that's been one of the most enriching things about this type of project. I am someone, my approach tends to be discourse based. So I do think, that language is important, but it's allowed me to start questioning some of the terms that I've habitually used to think about play, like agency, for example, and to ask kind of deeper questions about what that is. So I do think it's really enriching, but it's also constantly destabilizing, which I tend to think is a good thing.
Well, as a linguist, I'm fascinated by that answer and by the thread running through this afternoon about narrative, about language, about words. And Professor Wood has mentioned in the chat, language matters when words are used in policy texts and discourses, and so on. And Sarah, so I'll hand over to one of the other groups. You can come back to us again, Wai Peng, if you have any more time.
Wow, okay. So actually, there's one question in my group. It surrounds the term digital play, and actually we were curious about the so-called good practice in promoting digital play. So as teachers or practitioners, actually, what we should do or to embrace this kind of so-called digital play to support our digital natives. And this is a general, maybe we can invite just anybody who would like to give an answer.
I guess I would say, is it digital play or is it play with digital technologies? Because if we say it's play with digital technologies, then those technologies are cultural tools, in the same way that a box of bricks is a cultural tool to support children's play. So I would argue that we should look at what young children are already doing, and Yinka's given us some just fascinating insights into children's competence. But I also know there's a fair amount of research that tells us that teachers are reluctant to have digital technologies in their settings because they think they get enough of that at home. They're really concerned with health and well-being. Those are legitimate concerns, but I come back to the point I made earlier, that children need to be producing their own content, because Yinka's shown us where that takes us, rather than consuming content.
Well, thank you, Professor Wood. Any other responses to this question? Actually, I have a follow-up question. Do you think that the training for our teachers about supporting our children to use digital technologies is sufficient?
I can't answer that question.
I'll speak to that one.
Glenda, I don't know, maybe Glenda would know a bit more about that, because they still have a thriving PGCE at Stranmillis University College.
Sure.
I would say yes, and I would say no. It very much depends on the route that the early years teacher decides to go down. So perhaps if they're in a more generic BEd route, I'm speaking of our own here, nobody else's, but perhaps there's so much going on within that Bachelor of Education that play in general is pushed out the window to ensure that special educational needs are catered for, that you've all the areas of learning catered for, and play as a whole isn't given enough attention. Whereas I head up the early years PGCE, where a play runs through that entire PGCE in that sense, and therefore I do feel that those students do come away with a real understanding of play as pedagogy. And in terms of the digital aspect, well, again, it's important. I think it's taking on board what Elizabeth has just said, in that sense that it's rather than digital play, it's play with digital technologies, and that they've the opportunity to see children playing out their funds of knowledge in real life situations, rather than simply being exposed to a table of iPads and allowed to play digital games that they might be doing in the home in any case.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Glenda. And okay, so we have limited time, and I'm wondering whether there are any questions from group 3. So okay.
Well,
I will pass back to group 1. Yes.
We had oh, sorry, Sarah, have you got one that you want to ask?
No, go ahead. I put mine in the chat, the one that emerged from.
I think yours was related to language, and I can see that Charlotte has commented that language it can be highly emotive. It's certainly highly relevant, isn't it? We had a really interesting question. I think it was from Charlotte, actually. It arises from the discussion around the simplification of play, which is in fact very complex. And the question is, how can we respond to this in practice?
So is it all right if I respond, Sharon, because it's something that I know Glenda and I have talked about a lot, and it's something that exercises us a great deal. The complexity of play. I think there's a comment here. Somebody says, I lecture on the PGC 5 to 11, half a day EYFS, and they can end up in reception classes. Okay, so let's go back to initial teacher education. It needs to start there, engaging the students with the research, but also helping them to work out the so what does this mean for practice. I think, although I've been quite critical of policy in not just today, but in a few of my publications, the job of policy is not to present complexity. Policy by its very nature is reductive in terms of the kind of statements it makes. It isn't the place of policy to say, well, and here are 6 essential pieces of guidance from Brian Sutton Smith's work or from Glenda Walsh's work or whatever. But engaging with the evidence and engaging with the research is really important. And it's pointless saying we need a randomized controlled trial on play before we can say anything definitive. A, it's deeply that would be deeply unethical. And B, as I said earlier, play is not good at producing immediate learning outcomes.
No.
And I think so we've got complexity in play in the research, but we've got this complexity in practice. We are dealing with you know, intellectually complex problems here, which is why policy doesn't come anywhere near telling us what play is and why play is so important for children. Well, for human beings, not just for children.
And I maybe might add to that in the sense that, well, realistically speaking, from a student teacher perspective, I think they do need to be taught how to play themselves, in that sense, to be able to put play into practice in the classroom. And we had a team of Danish experts over with us who were telling us all about play labs and where their student teachers and their equivalent teacher training colleges in that sense were actually given the opportunity to go into a play lab and actually play. And because those are the skills that teachers need to have in that sense, or early years educators as a whole. So thinking up ways whereby we can teach our student teachers or student early years educators to be playful, I think is absolutely paramount.
Yeah. And I will come back to this idea of policy amnesia, because many years ago, under the Labour government, when we had the Department for Children, Schools and Families, a team of us worked on 2 very substantial documents. One was synthesizing the research on play, and the second was guidance for practice. The point at which the Labour government lost the election and we got the new coalition, everything was archived. So not only was that lost knowledge and lost expertise, it was a massive waste of taxpayers' money.
Okay.
Is it okay to quickly add something to the discussion, not to speak to policy, because there's so many complexities in thinking about how we represent and champion play at the policy level. Professor Wood has spoken really well to that. But just thinking about how we support this in practice, our work so far points to there being real promise in the use of video as a tool for practitioners to reflect on their practice and notice themselves the opportunities for play, the complexity for the child in their play. It's in the busyness of a classroom situation, it's very difficult to pick up on the child's cues and signals, to see what they're bringing to their play, to see where the play is going, and to see how important the teacher's own role is in supporting that play in very nuanced and subtle ways. And video can be really powerful to show teachers that they are doing it, and actually they're probably doing it better than they think they are, and to take that away and to develop it further. So we've had really positive feedback to draw out the complexity of play through video as a tool. So just to add that into the discussion and food for thought.
Can I just add, I think also understanding the complexity of children really helps. I think, you know, particularly in the culture in Britain, I would say that there is a tendency to assume that children aren't as much as adults on every register, and actually when I was a teacher, I remember when I was in a year 3 class and I asked to go to reception, and when it was announced, the parents rushed in and were appalled that I'd been demoted. They just couldn't imagine that I wanted to work with young children. Oh, you're such a good teacher. And it was that kind of thing. But actually, that's one of the reasons I want to be in reception and that I love being in nursery, is the complexity of what's happening. And certainly when I compared my experience in year 3, looking around my classroom, I very quickly knew what was happening because I'd actually done most of the work in deciding what was going to happen. Where my overriding memory of nursery is constantly thinking, what am I looking at? And realizing that a lot of what I had to do was stand back, watch, think, analyze, not storm in. And that's always been my approach to parenting as well. And that's when you realize that people will interrupt and take over from children in a way they would never do to an adult. And I think it comes from that lack of respect and the image of what a child is. And it's not a coincidence that Reggio has a very much more respectful image of who the child is, which is at the core of then informing who the teacher is and what their role is.
Very much so.
Thank you. Yeah. So actually, it seems that we are also considering, when we talk about the complexity of children and play, we are also thinking about the role of teachers and to what percentage they should play a part in children's play. And this seems to link back to the Christine's concept, playful learning or guided play. Yeah. So when we talk about guided play, how much guidance should we provide to our children? So yeah. So thank you so much for all the great insights. And I think this is a really great experience for our practitioners and researchers in the field of play. So I would like to just pass the mic back to Sharon to close today's great event.
Thank
To
you so
Sharon.
much.
To Sharon.
Thanks so much, Wai Peng, and thank you also, Sarah. It's been a great event and wonderful to co-host together. On behalf of everyone, I would like to thank our guest contributors for their really rich input today. As a linguist, I'm going to just pick out some of the key words that have jumped out at me. We've had making sense, we've had pandemic, we've had imagination, mental health, critiquing language, narrative of policy, low stakes environment in education, working together, not just play, playful pedagogy, playful professionals. And that has certainly given me a lot to take away and work with as I try to improve my own practice in education. So thank you for all of you for joining us also. Just before we close, I'd just like to remind you that we do host events like this regularly. And if you've enjoyed this one, I hope you will maybe join us for events in the future. And in fact, not to give too much away, but I do believe there are plans afoot for a face-to-face event, which will relate to a very pertinent theme to today's discussions in 2024. So look out for that. Do check the BERA website and also our British Curriculum Forum Twitter account if you're on Twitter. But all that remains is to thank everyone and to wish you a very good evening. Thank you, Elizabeth, Glenda, Christine, and Yinka especially.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Wei Peng.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.